Righto, good afternoon, everybody. Can I firstly welcome you all to this lunchtime lecture of the IAgrE. My name is Paul Hemingway, and I'm chairing the meeting this afternoon. Can I start by welcoming Jonathan Lodge from City Farm Systems, who's going to address us today with some interesting comments, I think, about the efficiency and data surrounding production of food, and I think probably particularly salad, but we'll get on to that. Jonathan was born in Devon, in a very rural environment, he tells me, and in his early career qualified as a DT teacher. He opted out of that for reasons best known to himself, and worked in a variety of public sector roles. But there was a common theme there, really, of elimination of wastage within the sectors with which he worked, broadly the health service and the police. He also had a very keen interest in veg gardening, and I suppose this concept of minimizing waste and producing vegetables really led him on to the career path that he's now gone down, with the result that he set up City Farm Systems, which he's been developing over the past few years. I think without further ado, because time is always short at these meetings, I'll now hand over to Jonathan for his address. If any of you do have any questions as you run along, I'd ask that you please put them in the chat, and we'll pick them up towards the end of the session. Jonathan, over to you.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. It's hard to believe we're now 6 years on from the institution's conference about decarbonising agriculture. My contribution highlighted what we could achieve with data and led on to my contribution to an academic book about artificial intelligence in agriculture. It was around that time that Professor Jane Rickman agreed to become our president. With her specialism in soils, she asked a question that set me on a new path of learning. The more we refine growing without soils, the better I understand it. For agriculture as a whole, those 6 years have seen a lot of hot air devoted to carbon, but ignoring those who can show the way forward, too many still increase the need for energy, only to hit a crisis point last year. And we're now at a point where those who know about ChatGPT have changed the term to augmented intelligence, as in using online information to help us rather than replace us. When I spoke to Sarah about today's event after the August lecture, we could see my thinking would make a good follow-on. To link the two, I did think about changing the title to History, Statistics and Nutrition. We know there is a need to reduce corporate greenwashing. We certainly need to stop mis-selling in the PV sector. Bentley Motors were praised for installing 2.7 megawatts of solar PV above their car parks, yet, angled at 5 degrees, they are never perpendicular to the sun. Why should we allow pressure groups to campaign for much needed farmland to be used for PV when the reality is so far from what they claim? PV needs to be installed at 40 degrees to get close to its potential at midday. The graphs on the lower right show what really happened in August. That's our home installation, an almost 5-fold change from one day to next. But if we look closer, we can see the output vary from more than one data point to the next, far more. I remember a question at Christmas from a vertical farm fan asking how many solar panels he would need to deliver the 52 megawatt he expected to use. He went very quiet when I showed there was no chance PV could power him through a winter. Then there is carbon. Solar PV does nothing to remove carbon, while regenerative agriculture can rebuild carbon and moisture retention. At the 2017 conference, NFU's head of renewables, Jonathan Scurlock, showcased grazing sheep around PV as best practice. They found no noticeable reduction in grass growth compared to an open field, mostly because grass carries on growing through a hot summer when many plants stop growing as they reach 30 degrees. 2 years earlier, I had asked him why so many use the fossil-fueled overhead rather than sheep to control the weeds. A couple of years ago, I mentioned this to the CEO of a Berkshire Local Enterprise Partnership when talking about the number of PV installations seen alongside the M4. She told me she had been at DEFRA when they removed the ruling that feed-in tariffs will not be paid if the land used for solar PV had an additional income. So that's a classic case of subsidy preventing best practice. When I was at the Kent County Show in July, I saw some of the machinery used to cut down weeds around orchard trees, and couldn't help remembering seeing sheep doing that in my childhood, and that a lot of effort has to go into preventing these machines from damaging the tree trunks. I can also remember the manager at the Duchy of Cornwall's home farm talk about how by choice cows would shelter in woodlands when chewing the cud. Using one Ben Taylor Davies slides from last year's conference, I also added the key point that drives the move of vertical farms to the Middle East. I'll show later why this is not necessary and give city farm systems a key advantage. Mike Barry was still head of Plan A for Marks and Spencer's when, during a lockdown webinar, he said some farms are nearing net zero at the farm gate. So my work is all based around how this simplistic headline completely ignores the fact that most of the cost of our food is added along the supply chain. Again, at the Kent County Show, I heard yet another accusation that supermarkets are ripping off the consumer. I interjected saying that whilst they have many faults, in terms of percentages, only farmers take less profit from our food. We need to question why so many resources are spent growing food we know will be wasted or has no nutritional value. At the RPG's conference in May, Baroness Bennett spoke about the amount of energy needed to produce food. She didn't mention the term, but if you look, you'll find discussions about the return on investment for the energy used, or EROI. Historically, when the seed merchants created what we now understood as the commercial credit, there was as much as a 10-to-1 return, with all food being ultra-local. Over the 20th century, that reversed, with many taking 10 units for each unit harvested. So the revolutions, largely enabled by fossil fuels, enabled greater distances between farmers and consumers. So the EROI deteriorated further, and states in the Middle East that once struggled for food see much of their food air freighted in. So a couple of years back, we had an intern from Cranfield University, and one of the interns uncovered the fact that it takes 127 calories to air freight a single calorie of lettuce. Vertical farms are moving to places of low-cost energy, but as they abandon home markets and head for the Middle East, they will face fierce competition. Their activities are not much better than moving from coal to gas-fired power stations at a time authorities want to ban all fossil fuels. So spending that much to deliver rapidly grown lettuce led me to think about the nutritional values. In last week's Rural Policy Group's Red Talk about Max McGillivray made some excellent points of the power of brands and consumer awareness. Max mentioned Heinz tomato ketchup. So last year, some of the retailers refused to pay the price Heinz wanted. So refusing to budge, Heinz stood their ground until the retailers saw their customers go elsewhere. At that point, they agreed to the 50% increase Heinz had demanded. But you can imagine very little of that went to the grower. So let's actually start with the history I used for the title. And one of the biggest mistakes is not learning the histories, the lessons history highlights. We hear vegans claiming Henry VIII dying young is a reason we should stop eating meat, but they completely ignore the reality that he lived far longer than expected, and gout is often caused by sugar. Over the summer, an executive head chef in London told us about a conference for 600 people, and he faced a request for food issues, allergies or intolerances from 120, so that's 20% or 1 in 5. And yet in France, there are hotels that don't see a request for several months at a time. So food allergies and intolerances are pretty well uniquely British, and we need to look at that. So rather than rote learning of dates for monarchs, the school history needs relevance, which I would suggest means the need to teach about life before electricity, fossil fuels, and now not just before the internet, but about the time spent dialing numbers on a landline. We talk about collaboration and multidisciplinary approach, yet R&D funding is segregated into food, energy, and cities. There is pressure to stop the use of fossil fuels, yet oil is a starting point for a huge amount of fashion and contributes to plastics in oceans. And so a return to wool would make both fashion and food far more sustainable. So the UK was once able to feed itself with a huge proportion of a, albeit much smaller population, working in agriculture. So it's the Industrial Revolution needing labour, and the way to get it was to make farming less labour intensive. And the next pair of revolutions saw the introduction of railways that also enabled the first rapid long-distance communications and a clear route for future telecoms. This was the start of feeding a city becoming a rigid linear supply chain, which of course now is very heavily reinforced by single-use plastics. And then the third agricultural revolution saw a complete break between primary producers and consumers, and therefore also the point at which the processors were sucking out all the profits. When I talk about data, I often compare it to bees. So individually, a bee can achieve very little, and the same applies to an individual data point. We know how valuable bees are in nature, vital for pollinating flowers and crops. And collectively, a swarm of bees can survive a winter, pollinate many acres of flowers, and create honey. So then we move on to the fourth revolution, when elements of farming and industry learned the potential enabled by connectivity. Data was no longer simply about moving from Rolodex cards to electronic memory and onto computers. We now had the time and date stamp. In primary food production, the real value of bees is seen when a beehive is used to care for and manage a community of bees. And we're only starting to see the full potential of data, and we know it could put a stop to fraud, such as claimed sales of Manuka honey far exceeding the maximum possible. However, that also means the need for collaboration, unfortunately, an area where reluctance of food retailers actually sees their data losing its value. I can remember going to Morrison's during the lockdown. I was after some new cheese baps, and there were none on the shelf. Looking round, I saw a gaggle of about 6 people on the floor, ranging from the shelf stacker through to the senior management team. And as I peered over them, I actually saw the cheese baps I was after. And I said, "Excuse me?" And they said, "Oh, out of date." And again, that started me thinking in other areas of data. And my first thought was, well, why aren't they putting the date of expiry of their shelf life on the actual records within their database? But then I realized you don't actually need to. The database should be showing that if you have 100 units delivered on a Monday with a 5-day shelf life, it would be a very simple report to come out on Thursday showing they hadn't sold 50% of them yet, and they needed to do something like reduce the price or be prepared to get them off the shelf the next day. So there's so much more that can be done, and we need that collaboration and sharing of data. If we look at the typical life of a pig, we can see China's already applied blockchain principles and not only have full traceability, but the banks know how costs and invoices occur and are happier to finance that supply chain. They can trace back from the bacon and show what the value would be at every step of the journey and what the farmer has fed them, when they'd be ready for slaughter, and even the parents of the pig. And in fact, they've first showcased the ability of an iPhone to have pig face recognition back in 2018. So there's huge amounts that can be done with data if used properly. And so again, thinking about the way a city is at the end of a linear supply chain, we hear a lot about the need for circular economies. Industry and farming have adopted data and IT, but there's very little, if any, connectivity between each link along these overly complex food supplies. This means frozen lamb is arriving from New Zealand just as Welsh lambs heads to slaughter. And pears are now arriving from South Africa, Spain, Belgium, and Portugal, just as British orchards start harvesting. The result is lower market prices that could be avoided. We can also see how many crops are harvested to survive the supply chain rather than for eating and nutritional qualities. And of course, these supply chains are now heavily enforced with single-use plastics and increasingly expensive techniques designed to increase shelf life. So while some think about circularity can be achieved by donating end-of-life foods to the charities, food will never be circular in the sense of cradle to cradle or seed to seed after we've eaten it. Looking back to history, we can also see the noise about sewage and seawater is nothing new, as that is how the Victorians built their systems to clean up cities. We could also say we flush soil health down the toilet. And I wonder how many sewage overflows are caused by fatbergs. The Victorian drains we still rely on so heavily were not designed to see fats pour down them. Nobody would have dreamt of wasting such a valuable source of nutrition. So this slide is one we use to show why collaboration offers huge advantages. And we know food supply chains are overly complex with excessive cash and carbon overheads. It was a past director of Tesco who spoke to us about getting a pot of living plants to their shelves being 65% of their total cost. Much of that is the need to buy, transport, and dispose of transit-only packaging that too many don't recognise as a cost of distribution. Our ability to grow to order at point of need means packaging that is of no interest to the consumer can be totally avoided. And in fact, in India, they're using rooftop greenhouses to reduce the cost of fresh air for office buildings. So we can turn those into food production facilities and help feed those within the building. So not only making the building more efficient, but actually reducing their food costs. And we talk of that as consuming scope 1 emissions to avoid all related scope 3, which is a better than net zero solution. The majority of us now live in cities and too far away from primary food production. Yet here we see city buildings are paying to dump many of the resources needed for intensive greenhouse production. We often hear about the need to invest in indoor agriculture, but we would argue that far too many are failing to address the need to shorten those supply chains. So how smart can a city be if it wastes valuable resources while multiplying the cost of food? And so that on the top right there, the Handbook of Smart Cities, I was asked to contribute a chapter to that, so I called it Feeding a Smart City. We've seen some excellent practices by some indoor growers co-locating with sources of heat and CO2, but they still depend on the traditional business model and costly distribution. So having said that, one does have to wonder how that will ever happen when the department Grant Shapps used to lead gives us this message. I used to share a house with a heat and vent controls engineer, and he tells me that most large buildings in London are paying to dump heat by midday in winter, and all large buildings must pay to dump CO2, whilst many of their indoor grower suppliers are having to try and run gas boilers all summer simply to create the carbon dioxide their intensive crops need. And here's a key part of the problem. A truck can carry 26 tons of grain and only needs to reserve a small amount of packaging to deliver packed potatoes. Whilst converting them to crisps, a truck can only deliver 1.3 tons and along with a lot of expensive single-use packaging. So back to the need to feeding a city, and we now have 13 UK cities introducing access charging with a dozen more in planning. London needs 17,500 tons of food to arrive each day, but we also know that 6,400 of that will be wasted. And we also know that London only actually carries enough food for a day and a half. That's a huge number of vehicles needed. If you take a close look at most supermarket wine, the label will tell you that, regardless of where it was made, it was bottled in Manchester after arriving there in bulk containers. This reduces the volume by a factor of 6 and avoids the need to transport glass, cardboard, and fresh air until that point. And while some climate activists are accused of wanting us to return to horse and cart, we should also recognise that many cities are so congested that traffic is no longer that fast. These points all factor in our thinking. And I can remember, it was late last year, hearing a Swedish vertical farm pitching for funds to build an 18,000 square metre facility where they would grow and pack 3 salad leaf varieties. And all I could think of was that they wanted to recreate the crisp supply chain and swap a long shelf life crisp for a perishable leaf. There are many headline-grabbing stories about vertical farms, although a few are starting to show the truth. Even earlier this year, I was at a Financial Times event in London. Talking to one of their local reporters, lead reporters at the bar, she spoke about wonderful vertical farms. Yet they published a report in 2020 suggesting there was only one making a profit globally. It's shocking that the financial press can have such conflicting articles. And to put that into perspective, most UK vertical farms are measuring their losses in tens of thousands of pounds per week. So this is another slide from Ben Taylor-Davies and showcases the madness of over-intensive farming. It's not the operator who makes the profit. He made a very good point about the reduction in chemical inputs that can be achieved by a regenerative farmer. And I like to think we can go a stage further and look at the whole supply chain costs. So, whilst the vertical farm may reduce food miles, why have they chosen to pay city overheads? We could install the same capacity on a distribution depot roof, or better still, on several customer roofs, and avoid the need for trucks and transit-only packaging. And we like to term that as swapping food miles for minutes and meters. Oh, God. So, collaborating in a city, we can work with customers to make the building more efficient. Our protected IP covers our ability to install an automated greenhouse with remote monitoring and crop planning. Crops are grown to order at point of need to avoid all costs of distribution and a better match between supply and demand. We use mobile crop trays, moving a wider range of crops past a smaller number of cameras and sensors, which allows us to control individual nutrients according to variety and stage of growth. And on this little diagram here, the middle section has a small propagation area alongside offices or commercial kitchens or educational and research facilities. And we can use an automated lift to move between levels. And this is a key part of enabling us to use a far wider range of age and ability. So we could actually have operators working in wheelchairs. Down at East Malling Research, their water efficient technologies, or WET Centre, has noted some significant differences in strawberry yield from one part of a polytunnel to another. And this is down to differences in light and temperature variations during the day. As one of their suppliers told us, partly that's due to their north-south orientation rather than east-west. I think it was David May of Lincoln's Institute of Agricultural Technology who mentioned at last week's Red Talk that 80% of the labour cost of modern strawberry growing was spent moving through the polytunnels. And this sounds much like Pareto's law, that 20% is the essential part, but the efficiencies can be found in the 80. I've had discussions with some involved, but not yet been able to persuade them they need a fundamental change. The need must be to reduce that travelling amongst the plants. We know cameras and sensors can detect issues long before the human eye. When looking at robotics, it is much like the complex food supply chains. We need to look for the intended outcome, which for a strawberry grower, of course, is not to travel between the crops, but to have picked and packed berries ready for transport. With some funding, we would soon showcase a strawberry growing facility on the roof of a data centre, with strawberry plants moving throughout the volume of the greenhouse, where the plants would all have similar conditions to avoid the variations seen at the wet centre. The crops move to simpler static pickers, which would avoid the big time lag between picking and packing. And I haven't actually studied it in strawberries, but if you go to some of the sweet pepper growers in the Netherlands, it can be several hours before picked sweet peppers can reach the pack house. So going further, This periodic table highlights the individual elements that are essential in biology. It also shows a separation of farming practices can be a big problem. Those who talk of soil as growing as hydroponics amuse me, as all plants with roots grow hydroponically. It is the chemistry of dissolved salts in water, and those without soil need to control them more tightly. A key point here, of course, is that elements are never isolated and the power of chemistry controls compounds and reactions. This is why nutrients for hydroponics are separated into two key concentrates to prevent or slow unwanted reactions. For a healthy human diet, we need to understand that plants grown in soils take up other trace elements coincidentally, some of these adding texture and flavour. Anyone who relies on synthetic fertilizers ignores these additional elements. So the more we are encouraged to turn to a plant-based diet, the less these additional elements are seen, and so our diets become less able to keep us healthy. And when we look at our need for micronutrients, I've rarely found anything mentioning lithium, yet we know it's the drug of choice to control bipolar disorders, so it must be essential. And if we look further at the extra 10 elements we need, it doesn't take long to see a lack of them leads on to most modern day ills. Unfortunately, the abuse of statistics is where many activists claim these are reasons we should turn to a plant-based diet. So picking on two fruit crops the James Hutton Institute were highlighting at Fruit Focus this year, here is a chart showing the chemical makeup. One hydroponic nutrient mix does not fit all crops, which is why it's hard for a vertical farm to grow more than salads, with electrical conductivity being far too blunt an instrument. In our systems, we can deliver nutrients to suit individual cultivars and stage of growth. So, keeping up to date, last week, Wyn Evans was shown to have won this year's Celebrity MasterChef, with a winning main course having bread of Evans that includes a slice of bread fried in the lamb juices. If we go compare that to the fried slice for an English breakfast, we'll see one is poor quality bread deep fried in vegetable oil with no sensible level of nutrition. Comparing that to the other, we see many essential nutrients and packed with flavour. So we live in a bizarre time with supermarkets selling goose fat for roasting our potatoes, and in another aisle, cans of vegan ghee. Reading the label shows it to be 80% palm oil. So how is that reducing deforestation and loss of wildlife? Most claim is driven by livestock farming. So those of us who are old enough can remember the power of positive marking for British agriculture. As those government bodies were sold off, agriculture has been the poor relation of corporates who steadily stripped out the profits. If these initiatives were rebuilt, we might actually see more relevant R&D funding and a much healthier farming sector. So when someone talks to me about circular economies, I'm always reminded of this upside-down pyramid and the misguided use of statistics. Many local authorities boast about the amount of recycled waste. Typically, they say 80% of so many thousand tonnes collected was recycled. But we now know much of that is not actually recycled. And again, some could be avoided, while some waste will never be recycled. So we know that much more could be done to avoid food waste, but as the total level of waste dropped, the amount recycled would actually be a smaller proportion of total waste. So rather than hearing about percentage recycled, we really should hear about total amounts going to landfill. So coming back again, this is the food hall in Slough. Several years back, they proudly presented this living wall on the north face of buildings with lights to spotlight their green credentials that had now dried up. There were only half a dozen plants alive when I took this photo in spring. So we know an architect who was credited with building Germany's greenest supermarket in 2014. And that was the start of their green building movement. He now realizes how much greener the building could have been if it included one of our food-producing greenhouses. He also talks about living walls like this needing to be removed as they harbour pests. And after nesting and hatching their eggs, birds can't find the food they need for their young. One could argue that's very similar to the problem with bees in areas of monoculture. I don't think the two are connected, but now Mike Barry is no longer head of Plan A for Marks and Spencer's. He's changed his tune. So he's now saying large corporates need to support rather than order their value chain to transform sustainably. And of course, that's not something many are used to. He says only those that will do it will survive and come out the other side. So here are some of our key drivers. We can use data to unlock benefits, and in our case, benefits that can only be found by growing to order at point of need. We like to think we can offer a carbon-consuming supply chain, which is a better than net zero solution. We talk about it as distributed growing and reducing the need for energy. We could actually power one of our greenhouses with a few solar panels through most of a summer. And arguably, one of the key points here that the failings of a vertical farm is that they talk of being able to grow all year, but overlook the fact that the salad demand halves in a UK winter or disappears in a summer, in a hot summer. So the hotels in London don't have conferences over the whole summer, and so they just don't need it. And at the same time, we've got traditional growers hitting peak season, so wholesale prices drop. So we talk about our cost reduction abilities, making healthy food affordable and hand shelf life to the consumer. We also like to think of it as moving farmers along the value chain. And when you look at the growing educational aspects around that, we talk of growing an education with STEM. So I think that's a good point to hand over to Paul again and ask if there are any questions.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan, for a very wide-ranging, data-filled presentation, I must say. I just head is slightly spinning with facts. I don't see any questions yet in the chat. So can I just ask, clearly you've been preaching this message now for 3, 4, 5 years. I mean, you've thought about it hugely. Where do you think the best opportunities are for matching the output of a rooftop greenhouse with the residential capacity or the shopping capacity of the building underneath that greenhouse? Because, you know, I'm not a logistics man, but I do have a greenhouse and have a fair idea what that will produce in optimum conditions.
That's a very good point. Thank you. Our calculations show that half a supermarket roof would enable us to grow more than they could sell of what would really be worth growing locally. We're never going to grow the sweet peppers at scale on a low-pitched roof, but we can grow the small crops. At the moment, we're focusing on sort of 0.5 meter in height, and it's very interesting. One of the key points about strawberries is actually they ripen with the sun. So equally, we can look at matching supply and demand more closely. So this is where AI and actually the machine learning aspects really come into its own. So rather than most vertical farms are trying to grow at absolute maximum capacity at all times to try and cover some of their costs. Yep. They never will. And we say that by taking out the costs, we can grow more appropriately locally. And AI allows us, again, this is part of the data sharing aspect, and we liken a huge amount of our thinking actually to that of solar PV. So the primary benefit is the building below, because obviously you then cut out the cost of distribution. But if you take short cycle crops and look backwards, you can actually plot a growing cycle and do very appropriate crop planning. And also you can look at varying the crops that you grow to suit what's needed. So again, if we were on top of a London hotel, we wouldn't be growing microherbs through the summer, and we could be growing plants. And this is another bugbear of mine, that we always hear R&D funding poking at food, and all they're doing is ramming more food into the start of the supply chain. And I'm saying, but we need to let food out the other end of the supply chain. and look at what can be achieved and actually balance with, we don't only need food, we need the other things, we need ornamentals. And there's a huge amount of balancing capacity with ornamentals that can be achieved. I hope that addresses some of those points.
Thank you, yes. Do we have any other questions from any of the audience? Jane, if we can go to you in Cranfield.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Jonathan. That was really, really interesting. Can I ask a sort of engineering question? Is the idea that these units would be retrofitted onto existing buildings? And as a supplementary, what about the sort of loading, the weight? I'm thinking the water, the vegetation itself probably won't be very heavy, but certainly the growing media. And I'd be really interested in the sort of the engineering, building engineering aspects of that. Has that been looked into? I'm sure it has.
Very much so. Thank you. Yes, good to see you, Jane. A lot of it is, so our protected IP, I have patents on how we could, if you look at a strawberry facility, again, they're tabletop growing. And if you actually have those as mobile, we can mount those on the framing for the polytunnel or greenhouse. So we can actually point load all those loadings through to the structural load-bearing points of a steel frame building or perimeter buildings, walls, I should say. So yes, that's very much been thought of. We can use rainwater harvesting. And again, some people point at, oh, well, they've got air handling units on the roof. Well, thank you very much. That's exactly what we want. We want that rainwater harvesting. Yes, it's not a total one size fits all, obviously, but there are a huge number of roofs that will take this, and there's ways of achieving it very neatly. And again, actually, what I would really like to see is as we increase the number of installations, rather than asking PhD students to actually undertake individual growing trials, we could actually take every trial they'd like to conceive of and move that into our spare capacity in some places, or even move some of those studies across to real life situations and have a data mining exercise.
Okay. And have there been studies published on that, on the sort of technical engineering of the building and the facility? Have there been studies on that, looking at load bearing and stuff?
There's plenty of it. Actually, it's an interesting point. It's not the load-bearing aspect is not so much the weight. The bigger issue will actually be wind loading.
Yes, yes.
And funnily enough, later this afternoon, we're having a meeting with the Building Research Establishment, who would actually quite like us to be based at their base at Watford. And they have been talking, they have their BREEAM standards. So it's the Building Research Establishment Environmental Assessment Method, I think they call it. And there's suggestions there that retrofitting our systems would actually enable a building to claim innovation points in their BREEAM in use standard. So yes, we've thought about it. We thought very hard about it. We know a lot about it, and we would love to be working further with BRE and actually giving some of those full-on assessments to prove it.
Very good. Thanks, Jonathan. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, anybody else? I sense that everybody's... John Steele has his hand up.
Hi, Jonathan. That's I missed the first part, so I'm hearing you talk very much about commercial properties. What about smaller side, or micro, like domestic dwellings and things like that? How much can be applied in that direction?
That's a very good point. Thank you. We use a modular approach and 2 meter wide modules. And depending on where you want to install it, we can start with a single module. We can move up to several modules with maybe a actual corridor you can walk along to have the access points. As you get more, we would actually add automation to have intra-module transfer completely automated. And we can then carry on and have what I would love is to work with a supermarket properly and actually have the data handling aspects. So we have a lift module on the big unit coming down into the retail area. And because we track with RFID, because we've got to actually keep track of all that data, we could actually flag up screens with, here's your Basil will be with you in seconds, go get a pizza base, or other related marketing messages.
Okay, I was thinking more actually into housing directly for direct consumption by people.
Actually,
to a supermarket.
Yeah, residential housing would be very good. Supermarkets were my point of original inspiration when I got stuck staring at the back of a Tesco truck for 10 minutes within sight of its store. And when I got inside, the fresh produce shelves are bare. But yeah, a residential housing block would be perfect. And you'd start actually, one of the key points about any smart city is not everybody can go to university. We need work for some of these people that want more flexible working, that want more kind working, if you like. During the Kickstart process, we had one of the lads working for us there who'd come from being a shelf stacker at Tesco. And again, we have people approaching us, love the idea of what we do, and in far more appropriate work.
Okay, many thanks. Thank
you. Do you think that actually this could impede some flexibility of supermarkets in terms of their offerings, Jonathan? Because I mean, particularly with salad crops, which is really where you seem to be focusing, and from a weight point of view, that's the logical place to be. You know, I mean, very clearly, the demand for salad crops on Friday last week, with the coming weekend being hot, will be very discernibly different from the forecast for salad sales this Friday, when it's going to be much cooler next weekend. It's as simple as that, isn't it? You know, the weather changes, demand for salad crops fluctuates broadly. If you're producing yourself and you're locked in to that production.
That's a very good point. And it's one of the things that, so a vertical farm boasts about all year round production at fixed rates and can't flex, and certainly don't want to because they've got such expensive costs. But in actual fact, we can actually plan for some of that. So, for instance, strawberries grow ripen according to the sun. So if the sun doesn't shine, they're not ripening as fast.
Yeah, I know that.
And if you're growing salad crops, yeah, precisely that. I mean, you've got to plan some of it, and there are many ways to slow growth. So we've taken out a huge chunk of cost, so we can actually afford to grow more slowly, and we can actually use methods to slow growth. If you reduce their watering, or you reduce the CO2, or you let them get cooler overnight, you can actually slow growth. So short-term demand changes, you need the weather forecasts and work with it. But again, if it rains this afternoon, rather than have, you know, the supermarkets want a full shelf of salads for a bank holiday, and when it gets wet, it's not just 60%, it could be 100% that goes to waste. But we have the ability to actually leave it on the roof, and it'll grow for the, you do have to build it in and plan it correctly, but then you can have a wet afternoon where you leave it growing, and an unexpectedly warm day, you bring it down, you know, tomorrow's crop is only a few meters away. Okay. So again, AI and ML can really enable a better match of supply and demand.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Yeah, well, I got a question in the chat.
Yes, Tim. Sorry.
Just asking, Jonathan, how many supermarkets have actually installed greenhouses on their roofs? Have you got examples?
I'm not
Sorry,
sure.
I didn't hear that properly.
Tim, I think so. Tim's question was, are there any supermarkets with installed greenhouses on their roofs yet?
There have been some small ones trying it, but the big supermarkets are. Some of them have actually identified which building we go on first, but not yet. They don't want to pay for the first big pilot. We have got interest from European retailers, and in fact, it's the wife of the German architect has links there. And again, if we can get our full-scale pilot running, then there are lots of people that really do want it. And so a large part of what we've been working on is scalability, so we can actually achieve it rapidly.
Okay, thank you. William Waddle raises a question about, who's going to staff, where are the technicians going to come from? And my observation would be when you look at the general quality of supermarket plants outside, wilting in the sun normally outside the front door, the supermarkets are not known for their horticultural prowess, are they? By and
Very
large.
true. But the biggest point there, of course, is they don't really have the ability to water them. But we could actually bring them down from the roof, freshly watered, ready to sell. That's a very good point about their ornamentals as well, how they seem to be, what's the word for it? Showcasing them for others. So you go there, see them wilting, and think it's time to go to the garden centre and get your ornamentals. But fortunately, with cameras being able to detect pest and disease long before the human eye, we can do a lot of that remotely. And equally, I would argue that there are a lot of people who have worked in obscenely overfunded vertical farms who are keen to work for us. So those that have invested in vertical farms are actually training our future workforce.
Yeah.
And you don't need to be on hand all times. So we wouldn't need an agronomist for individual crops, because that can be advice given from a central point.
Yeah. But Paul mentioned part of my comment, which was quite right. I'm involved. I designed and installed a rainwater harvesting scheme in a conference centre in the middle of Birmingham. We collect rainwater off the main roofs, store it, quite a lot of it, feed it umpteen meters downstairs to flush the 4 women's toilets, and it worked very well. We could increase the capacity on collection, but that's another issue. We store about 5,000 litres. A litre of water, counting the sewage charge in, is nearly £4 a cubic metre. However, the big problem is all the staff on site, which is, I think, probably a payroll of about 10, no one has the interest or the technical ability, because all hospitality staff, to service it. So every 6 weeks or so, I am going in to open up and clean the filters, because it gets a lot of city centre, gets a lot of muck off the roofs, and the black sludge, and it's good enough when it reaches the toilet, but it's not, because your water regs allow you to use it for flushing toilets. So it's clean enough there, but the collection system, by the time it's taken the odd bird feather out the filters and this stuff, the problem is the servicing of it. It's compared with leaving Severn Trent to open the tap, it's very complicated. It's not what you. I think what you're saying is great, but is there not something in the message there that you're making something complicated? Yes, it's environmentally good, but anyway, your comments.
Well, thank you. That's an excellent introduction into some of the elements of it. So, funnily enough, we actually work with an M&E engineer who has been responsible for taking taking a major garden centre off grid, and he's done a lot of work within water as well. I guess you could argue that's all you've spoken about is stuff that needs to be done by the water company currently, and perhaps we should value that and understand it more when we just think of turning a tap and people just complain. But yeah, and if you're going in 6 weekly, then that's not a problem. We would expect to have a similar level of maintenance for various different aspects and overseeing it. So that's just simply building in the right level of maintenance. And of course, many greenhouses are rainwater harvesting, and they do say if you've got the right amount of buffer, as you correctly recognise, there is enough rainwater to water a greenhouse full of tomatoes. So there is enough water there. It does need to be cared for. It does need to be done in the right way. And again, you can put sensors in there if you've got problems. It always makes me laugh when we hear of people saying, oh, I've got this system. It gives me an alarm when something goes wrong. And I'm thinking, I don't want an alarm when something goes wrong. I want a report of when you put it right, how you put it right, and what we could do in the future to avoid the issue.
Tim, you've asked a question about the efficacy of rooftop solar.
Well, the majority of it isn't facing the right direction. Intriguingly, I was thinking about the other day that actually when you think of a field of crops, a lot of plants actually orientate their leaves to actually match the sun. And of course, the ultimate one for that is the sunflower with its head. Yeah, solar will not get you through a winter. I think I put on one of the slides, didn't I, that when I actually edited that slide, the claimed 14 gigawatt capacity was actually only delivering 5% of that capacity. Whereas plants don't have the same issues, and it's not as simple as the amount of sunlight. There is also so many other aspects of what a plant needs to grow that can be still carrying on when a cloud passes by.
Okay.
I guess to add to that, actually, the comparisons are very, very strong in that the primary benefit is the building below, and the so same skill sets, method statements, and risk assessments for installers would be used. And again, there are a large number of supermarkets that have given up the idea of PV on their rooftops because they could say they can't afford maybe they've changed in the last year, of course, but the amount of strengthening needed to carry those panels. So yeah, some very interesting comparisons, but our expectations are that we should be able to give a return on investment in half the time.
Half the time of
a PV.
Of a PV panel, right, okay. Yeah. Okay. Last call then, do we have any final question? Well, Jonathan, I see it's 5-2 now. No, I think everybody's, as I say, well, Jonathan, it falls to me then to thank you very, very much for taking the time both to put the presentation together, which must have taken some time because I haven't seen one for quite some time that's quite so data filled, and of course presenting it and answering our questions so ably this afternoon. So on behalf of the assembled gathering and the IAgrE, can I thank you very much indeed for your time.